I want to introduce you today to the study of social interaction and to some of the concepts that have been developed to think about interaction in a more systematic way. We use the word microsociology when we think about some of the most minute and seemingly trivial aspects of everyday life. They may seem trivial, but they turn out to be very significant. In microsociology, the focus is on interaction. It's on what happens between human beings when they're in each other's presence or when they're interacting in some other way. When this field was originally developed, it really had a lot of focus on physical co-presence, what happened in face-to-face interaction. But as time has gone on, and particularly as we have moved into a new phase where the internet has defined so much of social life, a lot of these concepts and ideas have had to be proven useful in the context of the World Wide Web. A lot of what we've done in sociology in the last few years is trying to show their applicability beyond social situations of physical co-presence. So what you're going to hear about today are concepts that were really developed long before the web came along, and at times as you're listening you'll probably think of ways that they can be adapted. Over the course of the last few years in our sociology department here at Princeton, for undergraduates working on their independent research, some of the most interesting theses being written have been by people trying to adapt these ideas, the ideas of sociologists of the 50s, 60s, and 70s on interaction, to the era in which we live. If the first characteristic of microsociology is the focus on interaction, the second characteristic is that it tends to identify neglected situations, things that people take for granted in everyday life. Most studies of microinteraction look at things most of us may have been slightly aware of, but not nearly as aware of as we are, say, the larger dimensions of social differentiation that make, for example, in-groups and out-groups. Those things we take less for granted and are more a part of our everyday life in a more explicit way. Microinteractions are things that are part of our everyday life in a more implicit way. The third thing is that people who are interested in microinteraction tend to be interested in the definition of the situation. And this is a really important concept. It's a very old concept in sociology. Every person who is in a situation or an interaction defines it in a very particular way. And a lot of what's going on in interactions between people has to do with their trying to collaborate and coordinate over what that situation actually is and how it's going to be defined. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And finally, fourth, in studies of microsociology and microinteraction, there's a focus on the self. There's a focus on how the self evolves and unfolds through processes of interaction, and how the self deals with situations in which it is vulnerable. And so the entire assumption behind this field is an attentiveness to the vulnerability of the self, the vulnerability of the definitions of situations that can always be challenged and changed and transformed through processes of interaction. Now, Erving Goffman, who was really the founding father of this field as it is conceived today, he really thought that this aspect of the self, its vulnerability, and the definition of the situation needed to be understood. Selves and definitions are fragile, and it was upon this fragility that he focused. What needed to be understood was that there was no real stability to these things in everyday life. Now, Goffman came up with a number of very extraordinary concepts to understand everyday life, and there were a multitude of them. But I'd like to focus on just a few to give you a flavor of Goffman's ideas. The first one is the idea of tie signs. Tie signs are the things that make relationships between people evident in public places. So take, for example, you're walking down the street, and you see two people holding hands. That's considered a tie sign. It shows that the people are connected to one another, that they actually know each other, that they have some kind of relationship with one another. Now, if it's in Princeton, you would think, oh, they must be in a relationship. And by that you might mean, well, they might be in a romantic relationship, perhaps. Perhaps you walk down the street on Saturday night and you see two men holding hands and you think, oh, those two people with gay identities are involved in a relationship. Well, you would think that in the United States, in most places. However, if you go to other parts of the world, it's very common to see men in the streets holding hands who are not in romantic relationships, who are not gay, who are friends, and you would assume that there is something different going on. But in the United States, if you see two people, male or female, or two females, or two males, walking down the streets holding hands, you might assume that there is some kind of romantic attachment between them. I'm really dying to know what this is like where you live, because I know that it varies a great deal. Now, there are other kinds of situations we think of as tie signs along those very lines. We know that there are times here in Princeton where you will see a woman or girls holding hands with no sexual or romantic relationship between them, particularly with girls. You tend to see that less in the case with older women and with men holding hands. And these are things that are fairly stable, that we pretty much know the meanings of most of the time. And that's an extreme case of a tie sign. But according to Goffman, many times tie signs are ambiguous. I have a colleague in the sociology faculty here in Princeton who is one of my best friends. I've known her since she was a graduate student elsewhere, and I was an assistant professor. I still remember the first time I met her at a colleague's office, and I knew at that moment in my first conversation with her that she was going to be a great sociologist. It was obvious to me. And as time has gone, I've watched her go from being a graduate student to being my next-door neighbor in my department, and I see her many times every day. We have a closeness to our relationship that would be very difficult for the average person to disentangle. First of all, when we're together, we know each other so well that we don't necessarily look at each other when we're talking. When we're walking down the street, I'll be looking down and she'll be looking down. We'll both keep looking down. We may be talking about an idea or something we're working on, but we'll still keep looking down. And that is something you'd normally associate with people who are incredibly intimate. And you would look at us, and some people might see us walking from a car to a parking lot or to a store on a weekend, and they might think, oh, that professor and Professor Denier, I didn't realize that they were a couple. They might think that because they would see a certain type of closeness between us. And the thing is, you would be right 95% of the time to intuit that from the things that you see. But you can't really know unless you talk to the people and know more about their biographies. Well, actually, talking to the people often is not good enough either, right? Because a lot of what we do in life, people in situations try to cover up their tie signs. A lot of social life, and this is another thing that Goffman argued, is about people trying to make their tie signs not clear to other people. Well, you might think, oh, they're a couple, trying not to look like a couple, right? And that's another possibility, of course, for any situation that you see. Now, people very often, according to Goffman, feel obligations to discuss publicly their tie signs. So, for example, I walk down the street with this friend, and I run into a third person who might think that she's my wife. So I immediately feel an obligation to say, oh, meet my colleague, Professor X, or meet my friend and colleague. She works in the sociology department with me. I have to give an explanation then for the nature of that tie. So Goffman is looking at small, minute aspects of public life, just like this, neglected situations and ground rules that are taken for granted by many, many people. What you should remember about tie signs is this, and a lot of what's interesting sociologically about tie signs, is not that I can stand up here and teach you what they are, and you can use this knowledge to go out there and be an expert on society. It's not like that at all. In fact, what Goffman argued was that many tie signs are ambiguous, that people have to spend lots of time trying to figure it out, and that there are no definite answers, in part because it's so context-specific. And part of that context we are trying to understand is the biographies of the people involved. When we know their biographies, we might know enough to disentangle what the meaning of that tie sign is, but not necessarily. For Goffman, what's interesting about tie signs is that an ongoing part of social life is the tendency to think about them, to talk about them, and to be confused by them. People can frequently classify others accurately, but it would be an overstatement to suggest that the existence and functioning of the social order depends upon it.